Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this April Fool's Day. We're a bit late. We all had a bit of technical issues, so it's not an April Fool's joke. We are joining you today for this April sanctions update. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us. Really quickly, my name is Louis Vargas. I'm the founder of NFCP, which is the Network for Financial Crime Prevention. And if you want more info on that, please reach out. We have a LinkedIn page, we have a website, but I don't want to, clog this up a bit more with me. I want to get this to our great speakers. So we're joined by Andrew Viloria, who has experience working at OFAC and also at various financial institutions and insurance companies, both in the US and in Europe. We're also joined by Ian Bolton, who has experience both in the financial industry, also for the Foreign Office in the UK, and now is the face of Sanctions SOS. And last but not least, we have Mark Handley from, where are you from, Mark, again? I'm drawing a blank because I'm so nervous.
Duane Morris is the
Yeah, Duane Morris, yes. So if you don't know him, you should. He is very knowledgeable in the sanctions world across the world. He also publishes a very well-respected tracker on all the sanctions around the world. So if you don't follow him or the others that I've mentioned, please do, because they're very knowledgeable, which you will put on display very shortly. So, we have Andrew here in Copenhagen with me, obviously not sitting next to me today, but then we have Ian coming to us from Manchester and Mark from London. So thank you all for joining us. And again, let's kind of just get into it. So the whole goal of this webinar is to get an update on the sanctions world, which is very dynamic. As we all know, things are changing all the time. So I'm hoping to have a monthly update where we could come together and just have a chat about what's going on. So today we're going to kick things off with Ian, who will give us a summary of what's going on in the UK.
Thank you, Louis. Yeah, just I guess a quick look back over the first sort of quarter of the year, and then a little bit ahead. We had a very dramatic announcement back in, I think, early January, that the UK government was going to try and use sanctions as a way of busting illegal immigration and people smuggling gangs. This is sort of something that we're keeping a close eye on, because they're looking to put in new primary legislation, which is interesting. There's mechanisms for secondary legislation in the UK system, which would have allowed them to put that sort of measure in straight away, but they want to do something a bit different, apparently. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. But we're expecting that legislation actually probably towards the end of this year, I reckon, just because of the amount of time it takes. But then away from that, we've also seen things moving on Syria. So we've seen some licensing around the sort of humanitarian situation, reconstruction efforts, given the fall of the Assad regime. We've also seen a focus on Sudan. The UK is looking to play an increasing role in and around Sudan, given the ongoing conflict there. They're sort of increasing the use of sanctions around that. And then Russia, as ever, is always sort of at the tip of the tongue for the UK government, and there's been a lot of focus on it. Obviously, we had the sort of 3-year anniversary, and there was a sort of wave of additional sanctions measures, particular focus on a designation around the shadow fleet. We haven't seen a huge number of new measures across any of the sort of UK sanctions regimes. It's largely been designations so far this year, and I think that's probably the direction of travel for the remainder of the year, dependent on what this illegal migration sanctions looks like. The other thing being that there's also an increasing focus on the sort of more of on the thematic sanctions regimes in the UK, it would appear. So the sort of human rights regime, the anti-corruption. And then in terms of wider things, we're seeing a bit more focus on guidance, a bit more focus on sort of engagement with industry and making things move a bit more smoothly. But then at the same time, we've finally seen some enforcement action in the UK. Last year was sort of this big announcement across the US, the UK, and the EU of sort of 2024 would be the year of enforcement. And unfortunately, in the UK, we barely saw any. We've had some fairly significant fines recently, one on a law firm, one on some charities for failing to provide information connected to sort of CT sanctions. I think it's a signal of general direction of travel. and we'll probably see a lot more of those enforcement cases coming through over the rest of the year. So a bit of a watching brief to see what's being targeted. Interesting to note that it's not the traditional sort of banks that they're going after necessarily. It is looking a bit more broadly, like I said, charities, law firms. I suspect we'll see more around export controls, and also we'll start seeing people like OTSI, which is the new Office of Trade Sanctions implementation, trying to use their enforcement powers around export in third countries. And likewise, the Department for Transport now has enforcement measures for aviation and maritime. So I suspect again we'll see them exercising that power at some point, probably this year. So yeah, I guess that's sort of what we've seen so far. That's a bit of the direction of travel, and then it will be managing the fallout between ourselves and the divergence with other players. So for example, we're not expecting to see a huge increase in sanctions in the UK on China. And yet we may well be seeing that elsewhere. And I'll obviously leave Andrew to talk about the US side of things, but clearly there is a real risk around divergence. And between the UK and US, I think that has amongst the most potential to really be quite damaging in terms of how companies have to respond and what they have to focus on. So yeah, a bit of a brief but
Yeah.
happy to deal with questions or any other thoughts at any point.
No, thank you for that, Ian. And yeah, for those of you joining us, we won't get back to your questions live as we don't have that much time. But if you have any questions for any of our speakers or for me, please feel free to share it either directly with them or with me, and I'll help kind of disseminate it if possible. So thank you for that kind of quick tour of the UK sanctions update. And now I'll go to Mark, who will give us kind of the similar overview, but this time for EU sanctions. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Louis. So I think I can't possibly cover everything that's happened even this year. So I just want to focus on a few of the changes that will have the greatest impact on compliance. So I'm not going to deal with new designations and things like that. And we'll obviously be focusing on Russia, although there are changes elsewhere. Like Ian mentioned, there's been movement on the Syrian sanctions with the change of government and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and we can expect more there. So in February now that the EU introduced its 16th package, which had some changes in financial sanctions and some changes in trade sanctions. The biggest change in relation to financial sanctions was the introduction of the so-called best efforts requirement for EU parent companies in relation to foreign subsidiaries, making sure that those foreign subsidiaries didn't undermine the restrictive measures. And that mirrors a similar provision which had been introduced a couple of packages ago in relation to trade sanctions. As ever with EU legislation, an ideal burying of definitions in recitals which are normally non-operative. I would have thought that would be an easy fix to put it into the operative part of the legislation, but they haven't done that. It's important to mention that before this and before the similar provision was in relation to trade sanctions late last year, it was still the case that EU parent companies could attract liability if they're in relation to foreign subsidiaries and their actions, and especially if the EU parent was controlling or directing the actions of foreign subsidiaries. So to take FAQ, it is prohibited for EU parent companies to use their foreign subsidiaries to circumvent the obligations that apply to the EU parent. So in many ways, this isn't new. It was always the case that, if you can't do something, if it's unlawful for you to do it and you get someone else to do it, that's more than likely going to be circumventing. And that was always the case for parents. If you put in place a foreign subsidiary and get them to break EU sanctions, more than likely the EU parent is going to be liable for circumvention. So what the 16th package does is require the parent company to exercise the control that gives rise under normal legal principles to potential liability for the parent company because they're the one controlling the subsidiary. So they've closed a little bit of a potential by putting that in that best efforts requirement. It's worth noting that recent enforcement actions in places like Poland, Lithuania, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Denmark have included foreign subsidiaries. So again, this is not something new from the 16th package. It's been bolstered by the 16th package, but there's definitely something that's happening with focus on potential mechanism with Russian crude oil projects mirroring what had already been in place for LNG. There's going to be a creeping ban on the import of aluminium, which kicks in end of 2026. And there's a limit for how much Russian aluminium can be imported between now and then, but it's a complete ban come the end of next year. Other new prohibitions on certain chemicals and metals and software and so on that have been brought in. So it's worth sort of refreshing your export controls checks if you haven't already done so. There's a new prohibition on the provision of construction services to legal persons established in Russia or the Russian government. And there's a prohibition on providing temporary storage in the EU for Russian crude oil, even crude oil that's being exported under the oil price cap. And there's still the ban on storage. The transport sector has been targeted quite heavily. Transaction bans in relation to certain Russian ports and airports, flight bans on third country carriers who are doing domestic flights in Russia, and so on. So a range of new trade sanctions that were brought in under the 16th package. Can't possibly go through all the FAQs that have been introduced this year, though worth just for those who haven't seen, last week the EU launched an EU sanctions help desk targeting or specifically for small and medium sized enterprises, where they're offering sort of one-to-one bespoke customer service for people who call up and ask for help, including even conducting due diligence for the company that's calling up and asking for help, due diligence on a potential part, and getting a report back from this help desk on the potential counterpart. Obviously, there'll be caveated about no reliance can be placed on this and so on, I'm sure. But we're very, very interested to hear if anyone on this call has used that facility already and what they've got from that. As Louis mentioned, I have a blog cunningly called European Sanctions Enforcement, which tracks enforcement actions across Europe. So raids, prosecutions, investigations, convictions, fines. And so the EU, but also UK, Switzerland, Norway, places outside the EU. And from that, 2024 was a bumper year for enforcement in the EU. Over 88 million euros in fines, over 250 different fines, penalties, convictions, and so on. Those are minimums because a number of countries publish enforcement statistics, but not very detailed statistics. So the Finnish customs imposed got 99 convictions last year, but we don't know what penalties were imposed, what sentence, what fine, we just don't know. Dutch customs have had 64 monetary fines imposed since 2022, but again, they don't publish the size of the fines. They just say they range between 500 euros and 200,000 euros. So the real volume of fines is likely to be, or could easily be, significantly higher. So, I mean, a number of examples with countries, in the Nordic region where there've been active enforcement. Estonia got 8 criminal convictions last year, has more than 100 criminal cases ongoing. Denmark, the latest available data is from August 2023. At that time, they had 98 investigations ongoing, of which 16 had been referred to the police, and so on. Finland has had 909 convictions or fines since the beginning of 2022, which is way more than any other member state, at least that's publicly available. 909 is quite extraordinary. 143 of those are in the aggravated category, where there's a maximum prison sentence of up to 4 years. Serious conduct that's being identified, prosecuted, and convictions obtained. So the only last point is about sort of the end game, how the sanctions might come to an end. That's obviously topical at the moment. The EU has for a long time said that the sanctions would remain in place until full reparations were paid. That seems to have moved a little in the last week, where it was unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory was the precondition, a little different from the full payment of reparations. Whether that continues to move during the course of negotiations or not, who knows? Either of those preconditions may be too high a price for Russia to pay in any events. But it's interesting to see there's movement on that score. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you for that, Mark. I know it's not easy to summarize so much into a couple of minutes, but thank you for giving it a try. And next update, we'll definitely schedule more time on this because we could definitely spend more time for sure. So last but not least, Andrew, cognizant we started a little bit late and we have only about 6 minutes left, but can you give us an update on U.S. and OFAC sanctions?
Yeah, I sure can. I hope my audio is okay. I was having some issues, of course. So I think I do want to touch on something that Ian said that about the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K., which had been growing steadily during the Biden administration. The cooperation was something that hadn't been seen before. Just last month, well, at the beginning of February, the Trump administration issued the executive order initiating the ICC sanctions program, the International Criminal Court, and its very first designation was a UK national, someone based out of Scotland. And there's a couple layers here. One, targeting the ICC, and they cite the ICC's arrest warrants into Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu as its sole driving impetus. So that's the first issue, going against what the rest of the U.S. allies want. And then two, targeting a UK individual. It really complicates the relationship between the U.S. and the UK. And that's among all the other things that's happening between historical allies and the U.S. So things are complicated to say the least. And that's just the first thing from 2 months ago that I wanted to talk about. But it's a mess, as everyone. I also do want to mention that a couple weeks ago there was a Swedish designation coming out of OFAC, and it was related to the global terror program. And there's a criminal organization cited by OFAC, the Foxtrot organization in Sweden, and that again was a direct result of that organization's activities against Israel and Israeli embassies in Sweden, and I think here in Copenhagen as well. So we're seeing more politically charged designations coming from OFAC, less about national and international security and more about politics. And then something also to note is that just on Friday, there was a release. They called it a list update from OFAC. And what OFAC did was they added the secondary sanctions tag to thousands of names. And before, it used to be that if a non-U.S. company or financial institution was dealing with an SDN or sanctioned jurisdiction, you could gauge to see what the secondary sanctions risk was. There's a tag with each entry that says secondary sanctions risk, and if it had a tag, you knew that there was a direct exposure. If it didn't, you could kind of gauge that you were safe based on how significant your business is with the SDN. And now OFAC has added that tag to so many more. So you can see that OFAC is really driving the secondary sanctions, that tool that they have. And I think that that's in reflection to maybe the complicated relationship with U.S. Historic allies. And then something else that's not really OFAC related, but came from Commerce was the secondary tariff. So what the U.S. government has done is they've taken the concept of secondary sanctions and now they're applying it to tariffs. And so a new EO came out last week where they're going to start applying secondary tariffs to any country that is importing and re-exporting oil from Venezuela. So if they can't tariff the oil directly, then they're going to, we see more and more the U.S. and OFAC and agencies within the U.S. of broadening the tool belt and really trying to, I guess, increase the severity of what they can do on their own without cooperation from others. And I guess that's kind of the underlying theme of what's been going on. And I can say a lot more. I know that we're out of time, but it's a mess in the U.S. and it's rippling around the world.
That rhymed. It's a mess in the U.S. Good parting thoughts there.
That's my new slogan. Thank you so much.
No, thank you guys for joining, and thank you for our audience for joining. Sorry again, we got a bit of a late start and some technical issues, but yeah, I have some questions for our panelists, but they will go on LinkedIn, so they could respond there. As I said, if you have also questions for them, you could write it there or send it to me, and I'll help get it to them, because I know this was a too short of a session. Thanks again for everybody, especially our panelists. really great seeing you and hearing your perspective. And yeah, have a great rest of the day and looking forward to our update in May. Take care, guys.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.